Hello class, today we'll be talking about ecosystems in the biosphere. So some learning objectives for this chapter. We're going to be talking about the basic types of ecosystems. We're going to be differentiating between food chains and food webs. We're describing how organisms acquire energy from the food web, how that energy transfers through this web, biogeochemical cycles, some human implications for our behavior, basically impacting these cycles, abiotic factors that you see in the terrestrial biome, distinguishing characteristics of the 8 major terrestrial biomes, and then abiotic factors and how they affect the composition of plant and animal communities in the aquatic biomes, characteristics of oceanic zones, and then characteristics of standing versus flowing water in freshwater biomes. So we start off with the idea of an ecosystem. And ecosystem ecology is including all of the things that we've talked about before, this sort of idea of the organismal level, the population level, the community level. These are all interacting to form the ecosystem, which comprises essentially the living things of an environment and the non-living things as well for a given area. So examples of the non-living things would be like air, water, soil, and the climate itself. And so one of the major areas of study is how nutrients and energy get stored and cycled throughout an ecosystem. So the community of living organisms and their abiotic environment is an ecosystem, and there are some broad categories that we're going to be looking at, including freshwater, marine, and terrestrial ecosystems. Freshwater is the least common of these. Only around 1.8% of Earth's surface is covered in freshwater. The marine ecosystem is the most common, so 75% of the Earth's surface. And then, of course, the rest of that is terrestrial. So we're going to be looking at large-scale communities of organisms called biomes. And they are largely defined by the type of plant that grows there, but that is also influenced by annual rainfall and temperature as well. So ecosystems have a lot of moving parts, and one of those things that particularly disturbs them is called a disturbance event. So it's changes in the environment that affect the composition of the ecosystem. So any kind of variation in rainfall and temperature. But the ecosystem themselves are going to be in equilibrium, and so they have ways to resist change, this resistance, trying to stay at equilibrium in spite of these frequent disturbances. And then there is also a factor of resilience. So if there is a disturbance event, how fast can the ecosystem actually recover its equilibrium? One of the big areas of study here is going to be the food chain. And so this is essentially just a sequence of the organisms through which nutrients and energy are passing, basically as they're being consumed. And we assign them each a trophic level or an energy level that is going to correspond with its position in the food chain. And so the base of the food chain is going to be the producers. So in terrestrial environments, these are going to be the plants. In a marine environment, this could be plankton, for instance. And then the things that eat those, like the planktivores and the herbivores, are the primary consumers. And then you'll have the secondary consumers. These are things that eat primary consumers, so carnivores, for instance. And then you'll have tertiary consumers, which carnivores that can eat other carnivores as well. And so these are often apex consumers, so at the very top of the food chain. So here's an example of trophic levels in Lake Ontario. So you see the producer is some type of green algae. The primary consumer will be mollusks that eat that algae. The sculpins eat the mollusks, and the sculpins themselves are then eaten by the salmon. So kind of interrelated with this is a food web. And so with the food web, we're looking at multiple trophic interactions between the species, basically what feeds on it, what is it feeding on. And there are a couple different distinctions here. For instance, a grazing food web has plants or photosynthetic organisms at its base, and then you'll go through herbivores and carnivores. If it is a detrital food web, you're looking at feeding on decaying organic matter, so stuff from dead organisms. And there are two Subdistinctions here, the decomposer, which is actually breaking down that dead and decaying matter, and then the detritivores, which are living off of organic detritus. So how does energy flow from this food web? Well, this is an illustration actually of how the energy will move directionally through the ecosystem. And it's important to make the distinction how organisms are getting this energy in the first place. If an organism is autotrophic, it is essentially getting its energy from some kind of synthesis. So if it's a photoautotroph, it is using sunlight as an energy source, essentially fixing this inorganic CO2 from the atmosphere and turning it into organic carbon materials. And then you have the chemoautotrophs, which are using inorganic molecules as an energy source. So the rate at which producers can actually incorporate energy from the sun is an important measure, because this is going to tell you your gross primary productivity of a food web system. Now, a lot of this energy is being lost, though, and so we have to also make the distinction of the net primary productivity. So how much is actually getting through the system, not accounting for the loss from respiration and heat loss. So as you move through a food web, there is the possibility of biomagnification. If you have some type of like fat-soluble toxin, it can actually increase in concentration as it is consumed by the successive trophic levels. And so here's an example of that. When you look at the PCB concentrations found in these higher trophic levels are higher than in the lower trophic levels. Why? Because it is eating these things and biomagnifying, bioaccumulating these toxins. And so this is actually why you are not supposed to eat tuna fish too often, right? The mercury within the tuna fish has biomagnified. Okay, looking at the biogeochemical cycles, of course, energy and organic matter is being recycled throughout the system. But where is this matter coming from? Well, the inorganic side of it is just as important. Remember, inorganic elements often serve as cofactors for enzymes and such, and we're going to be looking at some very foundational elements and how they actually interact with this system. So you have this hydrosphere then. This is the area of Earth where water movement and storage occurs. So, of course, many different storage reservoirs, such as the surface water, groundwater, ice, water vapor. This is going to be important for cycling these other elements too. So we start off with the water cycle. Of course, water is the universal solvent. It's essential for all living processes. And the cycling of water goes through this sort of phase involving evaporation and sublimation, condensation and precipitation, and then of course things like accumulation of snow, which can lead to snow melts, that leads to stream flow, and there's actually some subsurface water flow as water is moving through porous rock and such. This process is going to be driven by the sun's energy. That's where the energy for evaporation is going to come from, and it is warming the oceans and surface waters. And then you also have this runoff effect. So rain is actually running off and leaching the soil for minerals, including carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, which get cycled from land to the water. And so we're going to look at all of these biogeochemical cycles. Here's an example of the water cycle. Evaporation, sublimation, eventually condenses into the clouds and falls as rain or snow. Okay, looking at carbon now. Carbon, of course, very vital for biology because it serves as the background for our macromolecules. And it's getting exchanged by consumption of autotrophs by the heterotrophs. These photosynthesizers are taking the inorganic carbon from the air, CO2, and then fixing it into organic molecules like glucose. So some common carbon reservoirs out in the environment include the atmosphere itself, of course, CO2, bodies of liquid water, including the ocean sediments, soil, and rocks, including the fossil fuels, and the Earth's interior. These fossil fuels constitute a non-renewable resource, so the process by which they are made takes a very long time. And then you also have these carbon sediments from the ocean floor basically being shoved deeper into the earth by subduction, essentially the movement of tectonic plates beneath each other. So, photosynthesis converts carbon dioxide gas to organic, and then it will cycle through the food web via consumption. So, moving on to nitrogen cycle. So, despite being 78% of our atmosphere, the nitrogen that we have around us is usually in a form that is not very useful. The triple covalent divalent nitrogen is so strongly bound that it's extremely inert, and so plants and phytoplankton are just not equipped to use this form of nitrogen. It has to be fixed somehow, and this nitrogen fixation is the conversion of N2 to more useful things like ammonia, nitrates, nitrites, etc. And so this is occurring in 3 steps: ammonification, nitrification, and denitrification, all mediated by a consortium of bacterial communities. And basically these bacteria are fixing the nitrogen into a useful form that can then be used by the plants. And so nitrogen actually is one of the sort of rate limiting nutrients for plants. And we can take advantage of that. We can actually supplement our nitrogen and help to increase the yield of plants. But you can do this too much. Overuse of the nitrogen fertilizer has consequences, including this process of eutrophication in fresh water. So nutrient runoff causes the overgrowth of algae and a number of consequential problems, especially fish kills. We're going to look at the concept of a dead zone in a second. So got that a little out of order, but looking at the phosphorus cycle now. Phosphorus, of course, a very important part of nucleic acids and the phospholipids. We actually have a phosphorus reservoir in our bones as well, helping to make up the hard structure of the bone. Mostly in nature as this phosphate ion, and it's going to come from inorganic sources, so leaching from phosphate-containing rocks. There's phosphate-containing ocean sediments. These phosphate stores actually came from the bodies of ocean organisms and their excretions, basically as they died. And it's exchanged between these marine organisms and the ocean itself. So this is another thing that you can supplement very easily in a fertilizer. The problem is if you overuse the fertilizers, you could lead to a dead zone forming. So this is an area where large areas of water essentially get depleted of their normal flora and fauna basically after algal blooms. So these algal blooms will occur. The algae will then die, and as it decomposes, it will deplete the area of oxygen. So moving on to the sulfur cycle. So sulfur is used in the amino acid cysteine and methionine, and cysteine is actually making these disulfur bridges to help form tertiary and quaternary structure of proteins. So very important. And it's cycling between the ocean, land, and atmosphere, mostly as sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere. But this is just a byproduct of decomposition of organic molecules. So also volcanic activity and geothermal vents are giving this off, but the burning of fossil fuels also generates this sulfur dioxide. So when I worked in the oil field, we would burn our methane in a high pressure flare, and all of our waste gases we would burn in a low pressure flare. The low pressure flare is where we would send the H2S, and you could actually see some brown residue around the flare. That would be the sulfur containing components basically falling out. But on land, sulfur gets deposited in 4 major ways. Of course, via precipitation, fallout from the atmosphere, weathering of sulfur-containing rocks, and then introduction via geothermal vents. One of the implications of this out in the environment is acid rain. So as rainwater falls to the ground through sulfur dioxide gas, it will actually convert into this weak sulfuric acid. And so that has implications for damage to human structures, etc. So looking at terrestrial biomes then, these are going to be land-based. There's 8 of them, and they have a characteristic temperature and precipitation. And so these are going to change the composition of animals there and organisms. So here are the 8 major biomes and where they are in the world. So we start off with the tropical forest. The book says these are also known as wet forests, but then it makes the distinction that there are also dry forests. Tend to be found in the equatorial regions, so they're getting a lot of sunlight. This is the most diverse terrestrial biome. In fact, there's so much diversity here that most of it is still not known to science. Average temp from 20 Celsius to 34 Celsius and 250 centimeters to 450 centimeters of rainfall. So what happens in these tropical forests is the layering of vegetation in these different habitats. And one example of that is the canopy. That would be the uppermost overhead layer of branches and leaves. And then you also have these dry forests. One characteristic of the dry forest is that they tend to lose their leaves, and so sunlight actually can reach the lower levels of the forest here. So very high species diversity. Moving on to the savannas. Savannas are grasslands with trees, essentially. So found in Africa, South America, and northern Australia. Temperatures will range from 24 to 29 Celsius and 51 to 127 centimeters of rainfall. Tend to have very extensive dry seasons followed by wet seasons. So the plants here have well-developed root systems, allowing them to basically come back after consequent fires. So fire would be a major disturbance in a savanna. Deserts. So these subtropical deserts exist between 15 degrees and 30 degrees north and south latitude, basically centered on the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn. They are often found on the downwind side of mountain ranges because there is a rain shadow effect that essentially leads to a wet side and a dry side. So soil temperature is very high here, surface temperature, above 60 Celsius in some cases. Meanwhile, nighttime temperatures can approach freezing, so 0 Celsius. Why is that? It's because there is such a lack of water, such a low humidity, that there is very rapid changes in temperature. So very low annual precipitation, less than 30 centimeters. And because of this very low species diversity, the organisms here are adapted to conserve water, essentially, like this cactus, this ocotillo. So we also have the chaparral. These are going to be the scrub forests. So California, the Mediterranean Sea, Australia. The annual rainfall is 65 to 75 centimeters, and most of this is falling in the winter. Very dry summers, and the plants here are dormant during the summertime for the most part. Dominated by shrubs, so adapted to periodic fibers as well. You have the temperate grasslands. These are found throughout North America. We would call them a prairie. Meanwhile, in Eurasia, they're referred to as steppes. So pronounced annual fluctuations in temperature, so very hot summers and cold winters. 25 to 89 centimeters of annual precipitation. Few trees, but you do see this sort of associated with rivers and streams, these sort of lowland woods. And then the dominant vegetation is going to be grass. These are essentially grasslands, right? Because of this, the vegetation can be very dense, and the soil is fertile because you have the very high density of roots and rhizomes from these grasslands. And these grasslands can support large herds of grazing animals, such as the American bison. Then you have the temperate forest. This is actually the most common biome in North America, Europe, Eastern Asia, Chile, and New Zealand. So temperatures are going to range from negative 30 Celsius to 30 Celsius, and annual rainfall between 75 to 150 centimeters. This biome is dominated by deciduous trees, and so fewer evergreen conifers, but they do exist here. A deciduous tree is a tree that loses its leaves each fall and will remain leafless over the winter. This leaf litter is actually an important part of the biome because it decays and the nutrients get released. It helps to protect the soil from erosion, it insulates the ground, and provides habitat for the little organisms that live in the leaf litter. Then you have the boreal forests, also known as the taiga. So this is going to be dominated by the coniferous and occurs across Canada, Alaska, Russia, and northern Europe. Annual precipitation 40 to 100 centimeters. Has long cold winters, and so the dominant life here is cold tolerant cone bearing plants. Very low net primary productivity. The forests are very slow growing and old. Species diversity is less than what we see in other forests. And one reason is it tends to lack that layered forest structure that is really allowing for stratified habitats. So, taiga dominated by low-lying plants and tall conifer trees. Further north than that, you have the Arctic tundra. So, located throughout the Arctic regions of the northern hemisphere. Winter temperature is very low, negative 34 Celsius. Average summer, 3 to 12 Celsius. Very low annual precipitation, too, 15 to 25 centimeters without much variation. And because of this, there's little species diversity. So there's low net primary productivity and low biomass above ground. When you look at the ground itself, it actually remains frozen in a perennial sense. We refer to that as permafrost. So you do see some low-growing plants like shrub willow in the tundra during the summer. And those were the 8 terrestrial biomes. Now we're going to move on to the aquatic and marine biomes. And these get influenced by abiotic factors as well, stuff like light, temperature, flow, and dissolved solids. As you move deeper into a body of water, eventually there is a portion where sunlight will no longer be able to penetrate. Then solar radiation is also affecting the temperature of a body of water, and this can actually lead to layering. So aquatic habitats that exist at the interface of marine and freshwater ecosystems have to deal with changes in salinity. We're going to look at that when we get to estuaries, but we would call this mixing of fresh and salt water brackish water. So starting off with the marine biome, the ocean itself is fairly continuous and relatively uniform because of that. And so we categorize it by several zones. The pelagic realm includes all of the open water. The benthic realm is extending along the ocean bottom from the shoreline to the deepest parts of the floor. And then from the surface to the bottom, the point at which you limit photosynthesis, about 200 meters, is the photic zone. So photosynthesis can still occur here. Below that point, we call it the aphotic zone because light is not penetrating any longer. So we've got the oceanic zone, the photic zone down to 200 meters, the aphotic zone down to 4,000 meters, and then below that is the abyssal zone. So lots of diversity out in the ocean, and we're going to look at some different partitions of the ocean itself, including the intertidal zone, the neritic zone, the oceanic zone, and the abyssal zone. The intertidal zone is the portion closest to land, and it has an extremely variable environment because of these tides coming in. Remember, the tides are being affected by the phase of the moon, how close it is to the Earth, and it is providing this variable environment for the life there. From the margin of the intertidal zone to the depths to about 200 meters, you have the neritic zone. And out in the neritic zone is where a lot of photosynthesis is going to occur because this is actually in the photic zone itself. And the little phytoplanktons that are there are forming the base of the food chain of the ocean via photosynthesis. Beyond that, you get to the oceanic zone, and then finally the deepest portion of the ocean is the abyssal zone. So below 4,000 meters, very cold, very high pressure. So sea star, sea urchin, sea mussels tend to find these in the intertidal zone. Okay, next is coral reefs. So these coral reefs are formed by marine invertebrates that are making the reef itself out of their little exoskeleton. Their exoskeletons are composed of calcium carbonate, and we call the little invertebrates that live within cryptofauna. So the shallower water corals actually have a mutualistic relationship with photosynthetic protists. And so this is a very diverse biome. They do tend to be located close to land, so they have the benefit of getting a lot of the nutrients that is being washed out to sea. Estuaries. So these are places where rivers meet the ocean. And so the mixing of the water here will result in a brackish water. And these are serving as little nurseries essentially for the offspring of crustaceans, mollusks, and fish. One of the big driving factors of diversity here is the salinity. So organisms have to be able to resist and adapt to changing salinity, essentially. So the adaptations of many of the organisms here are based on resisting changes in salinity. So for instance, the estuarine plants are halophytes, so plants that can tolerate salty conditions. So moving on to the freshwater biomes, these things would include lakes, ponds, and wetlands, as well as flowing rivers and streams. These, of course, are important to humans as well. This is where we get our drinking water. This is where we irrigate our crops from. This is where we get sanitation flowing water for recreation and industry. We call these benefits to us ecosystem services. So starting off with lakes and ponds, these can range in size from a few square meters to thousands of square kilometers. And these are going to be highly affected by temperature and light. These are going to drive stratification of the lake into layers. And of course, just like out in the ocean, you will have a photic layer where photosynthesis can occur. The limiting nutrients in lakes and ponds is going to be nitrogen. And so if humans overuse nitrogen-based fertilizer, you can get runoff into lakes and ponds, resulting in an algal bloom. And so as the algae increase in an aquatic system, they will actually die, decompose, and deplete the lake or pond of oxygen. So that will result in a fish kill. Rivers and streams, on the other hand, are continuously moving. And so they usually start at a source water that is usually cold, low nutrients, and clear. At the source water will be the point where the channel is narrowest. And as the stream flows away from the source, that channel width will actually increase, the current will slow down, and because of this, the temperature will increase. And then as the river reaches the ocean or another large body of water, you typically see a slowing down of this rate, and as a result, any sort of entrained silt is going to settle out. So rivers can be narrow and shallow to wide and slow moving. Moving on to wetlands. A wetland is defined by the soil being permanently or periodically saturated with water. And you're going to need a specialized type of plant to be able to resist that, these essentially being the emergent vegetation. So they stay rooted in the soil but have portions of their leaves, stems, and flowers extending above the water surface. So you've got freshwater marshes and swamps that are being characterized by the slow and steady water flow. Whereas if water flow was low or non-existent, you might consider it a bog. So bogs are stagnant, oxygen depleted, and they're acidic due to the buildup of organic acids due to just decomposition of organic material. Bog plants, like sundews, pitcher plants, etc., capture insects and extract the nitrogen from their bodies here because nitrogen uptake is very limited by the acidic conditions of the wetlands themselves. So, dominated by this emergent vegetation, rooted in the soil, but the rest of the portion will be above the water. And so that is the end of ecosystems and biospheres.